and she will talk about Myrtle and the women mystics.
Is this scary or what? This is nowhere near all of them, but you know, I just had to scare you a little bit. So, you know, years ago, my journey in Unity's been it's been a while, since the early 90s, like 1990. And I actually became a licensed teacher on a different path than the path that our dear beloved Meg is on. She's almost there too, which is super exciting. 10 years, I mean, it takes forever with Unity. We decided Jesus would never make it, I'll tell you. They keep changing the rules. Anyway, I was a licensed Unity teacher, and I was part of the Unity Church in Marin. And I just wanted to play with the big guys. I wanted to play with the ministers, and they wouldn't let me. It was like, no, 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 you can't come to these events. You are not a minister. You are only a licensed teacher. So I decided that I needed to get my doctorate in ministry and show them. Has anybody ever done anything like that? Where it's like, okay, I'm going to show you. You know, if you won't let me play with you, I'm going to just get bigger. Well, that was such a joke, I'll tell you. It took me 6.5 years to get my doctorate in ministry, and it was this that was my doctorate in ministry. I got it with Matthew Fox, and I think some of you know Matthew Fox. He wrote this amazing book called Original Blessing. And it's so in alignment with Unity and who we are and how we understand that we are indeed an original blessing. We are a blessing in the world. And it was through my journey with Matthew Fox that I was introduced to Hildegard von Bingen. And I think I've done a talk in the past just on Hildegard, so I'm not going to do that today, but I want to kind of touch on Hildegard. We could bring that next slide up just because there's a picture there of her. I was so inspired when I heard about Hildegard von Bingen. It was part of maybe one of the first classes I took at University of Creation and Spirituality. And Hildegard von Bingen she lived in you could see in the 11th century. She was born in 1098. And she was the 10th child of a family. And in those days, they tithed you. You were the 10th child, you get to go to the church. So she was basically given over to the church, and she was raised in a place called D.C. Bodyberg, which I had the blessing of going there in the year 2000. I went to Germany to really kind of study where Hildegard had lived. And she lived with basically mostly men, but she had a teacher as a young woman. And what happened for her came out of kind of her own inner physical struggles. She was one of these people who would often have massive headaches. She would have just be flattened. As I know sometimes we feel that. We feel like we're flattened, and maybe it's not in the physical. Maybe it's something that flattens us in the emotional or in our relationships. But she had this kind of physical suffering, and it was out of that she began to receive these amazing visions. She was not somebody who was schooled in the normal school. She was schooled through the church. So she didn't really, she began to understand Latin, and she started writing in Latin. She was a musician. She created what's called monophone. It's a one-tone music, which is really, really, it's very eerie, but it takes you in a very, very deep place. She was a poet. She also understood the healing power of stones. So when I went to Rudesheim, where one of the monasteries was, the streets are all filled with all these stone shops where you can buy different stones that have healing qualities to them. She wrote a book called Scivias, and part of the book included these small little illuminations that basically began to tell a story about how we are, as Matthew Fox said, we are born as these creative divine beings. She was later to form her own monastery, women only, across from what was a man's monastery that she was in for many, many years. And part of what Hildegard did was she spoke out against the patriarch of the church. She spoke out to the abbots, and when she found that something was not being properly attended to, not just around women, but about anything, she would write letters, and she would talk to she went all over to really be heard as a woman of power and a woman of big voice. And even at the end of her life, she was willing to bury a young man who had committed suicide in her grounds, which was very much against the church, needless to say. So there was a writing of Hildegard's that I read when I was first going to school with Matthew that really, really, it inspired my journey, both through this program with Matthew Fox, but it's really kind of inspired my journey in unity as well, because there was never really any difference. I was already, at the time I started my journey with Matthew, I was already looking at becoming a unity minister and starting my church in Berkeley. So this is what Hildegard said. She said, "Who are the prophets? They are a royal people who penetrate mystery and see with the Spirit's eyes. In illuminating darkness, they speak out. They are a living, penetrating clarity. They are a blossom, blooming only on the shoot that is rooted in the flood of light." Who are the prophets? She was talking about those who can carry this quality of what we can know as a mystical tradition of seeing beyond what's here. And that really kind of cemented my journey around looking further at what it meant to be a mystic, and also just inviting more awareness of who are the women mystics that have been part of our tradition over the years. And as I started this talk in my mind, I thought, well, I'm going to start with Myrtle, but I decided rather to kind of move through the ages with these various women, because I thought it was so interesting how each one of them brought different aspects in their awareness and their teaching, but there were a lot of similarities to what they had experienced in their life and the awarenesses they brought to in their writings. Most of them were writers. So the second one that I want to mention is Mechtild of Magdeberg, and she was an interesting one. I did not study as much of her as I did Hildegard and Julian of Norwich, but one of the interesting things about Mechtild was that when she was 12 years old, she started having visions, much younger than Hildegard. And of course, this happens for others of mystics, and maybe some of you have had visions when you're young. And she had these visions of the divine, and what she really felt was this connection of the divine presence as light. And she ended up writing a book that was called The Flowing Light of Divinity. She was very much aware of the creative energy that the divine holds within each one of us. And one of the things that was really interesting about Mechtild as a writer was she wrote in the vernacular. So where Hildegard, a century earlier, had been writing in Latin, and Latin was really all that people used to speak about spiritual life, Mechtild was the one who actually spoke and wrote in what's called Low German, so that more people could understand what she was bringing out into the world, the visions that she was carrying. So this was kind of a transition that was beginning to happen in terms of some of these women who are having mystical experiences. And the next one is one that I think a lot of us have heard of, and that's Julian of Norwich. She has a statement that I think people have heard, and the statement that she made was, "All shall be well, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." How does that resonate with Unity's teaching, right? Yeah, really, really powerful. The other thing about Julia, now she did not start having her visions until she was 30 years old. And then what she did was she became an anchorite. She lived in what, like a cell. She had like a little window out, and that was all that she could see in the world. She lived during the time of the Black Death. I mean, it was things going on in the outer were really, really terrible in her world. Can you see that? She lived 1343 to 1416. But she was the one who began to really talk about the presence of God, the presence of the divine as mother. In the past, it had all been very patriarchal. Even these women like Hildegard who were talking about it, she was talking about the creative energy of mother, and many of Hildegard's illuminations show mother as mother wisdom, as like Sophia. But it was Julian of Norwich who really anchored in this awareness of God as mother, father. She also said something that we say, I think, in Unity every day. She said, God is everything that is good. God is everything that is good. And the goodness that everything possesses is God. It's like, there's only one presence and one power active in my life, God the good. And I made in that image and likeness. I mean, she basically was holding the principles that we now, as, 21st century unitics, we hold that in our heart. And that was coming from these early women mystics, because this is not what the church was, this is not the message that the church was giving by any means. So the next one, let's do the next slide, because this is kind of like lineage, and it's the church, but it's very deep and powerful. So the next one I wanted to bring up, because I thought we'd do it in order of when they were born, is Myrtle. Now, Myrtle Fillmore, many of you know, I've talked about Myrtle before, but Myrtle Fillmore was the co-founder of Unity with Charles Fillmore. And we can think about most of the writing that we see in our Unity texts come from Charles. He sat in the silence and he downloaded that wonderful metaphysical Bible dictionary where he took all these different names and places in the Bible and he cemented them into where this is in the journey of the soul. I mean, he was amazing. He had kind of a capacity to connect at the level of the intellect, whereas Myrtle's, her ministry was a ministry of writing letters to people. They called her Mother Myrtle. She was the heart, really, of this duo that really founded the Unity movement. Myrtle, people would write to Myrtle with all sorts of problems, issues in their family, physical issues, alcoholism, problems, people don't have a job. It was just the kind of stuff that Dear Abby would get, maybe, but it was Dear Myrtle. And she would respond in her own way with letters, telling them her advice about the everyday, but it was always reminding them of the truth of who they were. The goodness of who they were, the power that dwelled within each person. That was really her passion. And interestingly enough, she started out in her ministry the same way Hildegard did, the same way some of these other women did. She had physical problems. She had issues in the physical body. She, as a young woman, had tuberculosis. And in those days, she had 3 boys, and she had Charles, who was very entrepreneurial, traveling to different parts of the country, doing, he was like a real estate investor. He was kind of a wild guy in the beginning. We don't see that part of Charles because we see him as sitting in this chair meditating, but he was an entrepreneur in his day. And Myrtle had these 3 boys. She was very much about the household. She had tuberculosis. You know, and in those days, that was a death sentence. It was like you got your feet wet, you're going to die kind of thing. So she went to this meeting with Charles. E.B. Weeks was a metaphysician from Emma Curtis Hopkins School, and Myrtle went to this meeting, and she got the message. You are a child of God. Therefore, you do not inherit sickness. This is not the nature of who you are. There's no inheritance of sickness. God, the good, wholeness is not sickness. She got that message, and she took it into a practical aspect of her life. She began to sit every day for hours. And she didn't just sit in the silence. She prayed to the health of her body. She prayed to the wholeness of all the organs in her body. She told her body how healthy it was. She said, I'm not going to talk about, my diseased liver anymore. I'm not going there anymore. I'm just going to speak to the health of my. And she healed herself because she was, I think, early 40s when she went to meet with E.B. Weeks. She lived to be 84 years old. And when she finally left, she'd been working at Unity Village, writing letters. She left because she said, I think that I can do my work better from the other side. She wasn't sick. She left, and 3 weeks later, she had passed away. And I, for one, feel like her work from the other side is quite extraordinary, really, really amazing. This is a book that you could tell I enjoyed. This is a book called Torchbearer to Light the Way, and it's written by a man named Neil Valle, who lived in Marin County, and I had the opportunity to meet with him and get to know him. He studied at Unity Village and went into all the archives to read all of Myrtle's old letters and really, really get a sense of who Myrtle Fillmore was and the many aspects of this incredible woman. But again, she carried this quality of awareness of the presence that is always in us all the time. I want to just move, I want to read something, and then we're going to look at Ananadamaya Ma for a minute here, but just thinking about mysticism. I mean, we could all have our own kind of definition of what is mysticism. Think about mystery. That kind of helps for me, mystery. But mysticism in its form is the science of ultimates, the science of union with the absolute and nothing else. And that the mystic is the person who attains to this union, not the person who talks about it. Not to know about, but to be is the mark of the real initiate. Mysticism is not an opinion. It is not a philosophy. It has nothing in common with the pursuit of occult knowledge. It is the name of the organic process which involves the perfect consummation of the love of God, the achievement here and now of the immortal heritage of man, of men and women. Or, if you like better, for this means exactly the same thing. It is the art of establishing the conscious relation with the absolute. And so when we think about these people like Hildegard von Bingen, Mechtild of Magdeberg, Julian of Norwich, Myrtle Fillmore, and I'm going to speak a moment about a mystic from India, Ananadamaya Ma. These people were not about learning about the presence of God. They were being. They were the embodiment of the presence of God. And I truly believe that Myrtle held that same quality of being in who she was, and why people were drawn to her presence, and why her very words were impactful in the same way someone like Ananadamaya Ma's very presence impacted people. I learned about Ananadamaya Ma when Roy, and my partner, he's a devotee of Yogananda, which I know David has said, speak about Yogananda. Anyway, we went to the Lakeside Temple, which is down in Southern California, and I learned about Ananadamaya Ma at the Lakeside Temple because she was very she was a friend of Yogananda's, so she lived during the time when Yogananda was alive. See, she didn't die till 1982, unlike Myrtle, who was gone by 1931. So Ananadamaya Ma was an interesting person. They think of her as a saint, but she was another one who, like Myrtle, was kind of a householder for a while. The custom in the day was she was married at age 12. Think about it. But she didn't live with her husband. She moved into the home of her brother-in-law, and she basically was taking care of the household for 5 years until she was 17. And during that time, she didn't speak. She didn't speak. She went about what she did in the household, but she would often go into these states, these like ecstatic states of being. So they knew something was going on with this young woman, but she had no education at all. Ultimately, she went to live with her husband when she was 17, but this was a marriage where they were completely celibate. Her husband, recognizing the presence that Ananadamaya Ma was carrying, became her devotee. And he basically was in service to her. She traveled around, and it's so interesting because she was not an educated woman, yet she could quote the Upanishads. She knew the Bhagavad Gita. It was like, as they say, when we go into these higher states of consciousness, we connect with a field not only of wisdom, inner wisdom, but we connect with the field of all that is. So she, as a person, people would sit around her, they would ask her questions, and she would answer. She didn't carry that silence that she had in her early years all the time, but oftentimes that's all she did. She would sit like this, and people would be healed. They would be transformed just by her presence because she was holding that beingness, that quality of the mystic. So she was a very powerful one, and I forget what her name. Her name is. I'm going to tell you what the translation of her name is. It's like blissful one. It is. Well, I can't remember. It's like blissful one. But I want to read a quote from her because I thought this was really interesting. She says, "Who is it that loves and who that suffers? He alone stages a play within himself." Could this be you and me? We love and we suffer. He alone stages a play within himself. Who exists save him. The individual suffers because she perceives duality. It is duality which causes all sorrow and grief. Find the one everywhere and in everything, and there will be an end to pain and suffering. This is this idea, and we talk about it in unity. Unity's not two-ness, right? It's about oneness. It's about that connection, not only that we have with the presence and the power of the divine, but the connection we have with all life. So when we find ourselves in conflict, we find ourselves in any kind of suffering, we need to look for that sense of oneness, that sense of connection. Whether it's a heart connection, whether it's a soul connection, whether it's a mental connection, we need to look for that place. And we find it by letting go and letting God, right? By opening ourselves up. When we kind of give up, then we can surrender to God. Hard to surrender until you give up. I don't know if anybody's tried. It doesn't work so well. So the final ones that I wanted to add here, and this is a little bit different because I don't see the 13 Indigenous grandmothers in the same way that I see these early mystics, but they're carrying a divine wisdom that I believe connects us to the one in a mystical way. And I don't know if people have heard of the grandmothers before, maybe some of you have. What happened was in around 2004, there was a woman in an organization in Northern California. Her name was Jyoti, which means light. And she was an American woman, and she had this idea to gather grandmothers from all over the world. So she gathered 13 of these indigenous grandmothers from Brazil, from Africa, from various tribes in the United States. from South America, from all over the world. And they became a unit called the 13 Indigenous Grandmothers. And they traveled and went to the Vatican. They did together, really anchoring in the indigenous culture that these women were carrying, and also carrying in a deep, deep reverence for the Mother Earth, and the creative energy of the Mother. So when I had my church in Berkeley, I had this idea to bring a grandmother. I couldn't get 13, but I thought maybe I can get one grandmother to Berkeley, because we used to do stuff like that. It was a bigger church than this. And Roy's family lived in South Dakota. So I made contact with Rita, who her name is Rita Long Visitor Holy Dance. Rita Long Visitor Holy Dance. She was one of the Indigenous grandmothers. She was a Lakota. And I made contact with her, and I set up an appointment to meet Rita Long Visitor Holy Dance at a casino, because that's where you meet when you're in South Dakota, and to talk to her about coming to Unity Berkeley. Well, it was quite the experience, I will tell you, because she brought all her relations. I got there, and there was like this huge table, and her son was there. He's her manager. And we had the conversation, and I bought them all whatever they needed to drink. And, it was like Coke. It wasn't anything like it. But it turned out that Rita Long Visitor Holy Dance was like a really big deal to get to come to Berkeley. It was going to be like, $10,000 traveling, because she didn't travel alone. But I had this opportunity to meet these people that were part of this culture, and it was just extraordinary because the network was there. It was like they were all taking care of one another in a very, very powerful way. So I wanted to bring these women in because I feel like culturally they bring a similar kind of energy that some of the early mystics brought. And I think it's important to kind of be aware of some of the similarities in some of these women, because I do believe they're not far from what we as male and female, this isn't about women, it's about the divine, the energy of the divine feminine that is an aspect of all creation. And when we think about these women, one of the things that kind of really struck me was that most of them went through some sort of physical suffering, or if they didn't go through a physical suffering themselves, they were living in a field of that kind of suffering, living in wartime, living in that kind of the season of the 100 Years' War, living during the Black Plague. These early women were, and Hildegard, the same thing. They were living in a time when women were not, their voices were not easily expressed. You had to have a lot of bold courage as a woman in those times. But there was this sense of something that was disconnected, whether it was a physical disconnection or they were somehow disconnected from the culture that was there. And I think that's often part of what starts our journey. That's why when I started talking today, I was telling you how I was feeling that. Like, I want to be there and they won't let me, and how there's that kind of inner, I call it divine discontent, but it might not be divine for initially. It might just be some other kind of upset that we have. But isn't it often that which kind of starts this well of seeking? It takes us on a journey, and where it takes us, we don't know. We don't know where we're going to go. But all of these women seem to have that. They all had this kind of quality of wisdom and activism in them, which I really, really think is powerful, because you often think about, the mystic as just being somebody who's going to sit in the silence. They did that, but then it was what they received, It was the flood of what they received that went out into the world, whether there was their writing, their music, or in the case of Hildegard, the healing that she offered through stones, Myrtle Fillmore and the letters that she wrote, these indigenous grandmothers, they carry seeds. They have a whole culture, and it's Flora Maya, who's in New Mexico. She's one of the living grandmothers right now. She carries a whole wisdom of seeds to be planted around so that certain cultures and certain indigenous plants are not going to become extinct. So there's beautiful things that are happening. There was also really, especially in these early women, there was an activism on a global stage, and that's part of what these indigenous grandmothers are doing. And you know, it's one of the things I wonder about unity. We haven't raised ourselves to that level as a community of consciousness in terms of unity all over the U.S. and beyond. To really be, we've gone to the World Parliament and been present and things like that, but it's a different quality. There was also this really deep sense of inner healing that each one of these women had, and not just physical, but just a sense of reconnecting to the truth of who they were at a deep, deep level. So I'm just feel excited to be able to kind of touch the hem of the garment of each of these women and know that it's part of the lineage for each one of us in a really deep and powerful way. You know, the grandmothers carry that and speak of that and speak about all our ancestors. We don't do that in our culture, do we? But it's so much a part of who we are. So whether it's the culture, European cultures, which is what these, you know, from Germany and from England, or whether it's the Midwest of Myrtle Fillmore, or the India of Ananadamaya Ma, or the indigenous cultures which are worldwide, we carry all of this inside of us at a really deep level. So I'd like to just take a time now and have us turn the lights out and just do a short connection, meditation, if you will. So just take a moment and settle into the body, turn within. In the silence of a medieval woman sealed within a single room. In the stillness of a child in a village, caring for family who didn't speak. In the quiet of a mother, a teacher who heard a deep voice within her heart. We remember that the divine speaks in stillness. And healing begins in surrender. Ananadamaya Ma, so very radiant in her wordless joy, reminds us, be anchored in fearlessness. Julian of Norwich assures us, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And Myrtle Fillmore, heart open in prayer and stillness. I am a child of God, therefore I do not inherit sickness. And so we breathe and let this be our moment of sacred silence. We surrender the need to fix, to strive, or to explain. And we open to the presence, to the divine presence within us. healing, joyful, resilient, and free. And may we walk the path of these women not by imitating them, but by trusting the divine already moving in and through our own lives, moment to moment, day to day. And in that trust, may we remember all shall be well, and we are already whole. And so it is. And taking a few moments to just rest in the stillness. We offer gratitude to Mother, Father, God, creator of all that is. And we give thanks for the blessing of this deep and powerful mystical lineage. And we hold the presence of the One in our hearts with love and gratitude. Amen. And gently, as you feel guided, bring your awareness back into your body, and as you feel ready, you can open your eyes.